The ballroom at Fenimore House smelled of beeswax candles and crushed roses, and every eye in the room was fixed on the same golden doorway, waiting for the Duke of Ashcombe to choose his bride. Seraphina Marchbanks stood beneath the great chandelier in ivory silk, her copper curls catching the candlelight like a struck match, and she knew, the way she had always known, that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. She had practiced this moment for 3 years, in front of looking glasses and dance masters and her mother's watchful, appraising eye. Before we continue, please subscribe and join us for more unforgettable tales of dukes, duchesses, hidden secrets, and love that changes everything. She had been told since she was a girl of 12 that her face was the one thing standing between her family and ruin. Tonight, at last, the debt would be paid. The musicians lowered their bows in unison. The crowd near the doorway parted like a curtain pulled by unseen hands. And Alaric Vane, Duke of Ashcombe, tall and silent in black superfine, walked into the room the way a man walks into a courtroom already knowing the verdict he intends to deliver. For one suspended heartbeat, Lynette wondered whether he had mistaken her for someone else. It would have been an understandable error. People mistook her for companions, poor relations, even servants with embarrassing regularity. Yet nothing in the Duke's expression suggested uncertainty. His hazel eyes were fixed on the ledger beneath her arm, then on her face, with the same grave attention he had once given a disputed column of rents. Lynette became painfully aware of every unfashionable detail of herself. The grey silk that had been brushed until the nap had thinned at the cuffs, the narrow ribbon at her throat, the stubborn strand of brown hair that had escaped its pins near her ear. Across the room, Seraphina remained perfectly still beneath the chandelier, all ivory brilliance and cultivated grace. The contrast between them could not have been sharper. That was precisely why the Duke's choice of direction felt less like a social surprise than an earthquake. Lady Fenimore lowered her fan. 2 dowagers leaned toward each other and forgot to whisper. Even the musicians, who had been trained to continue through fainting fits, broken engagements, and drunken speeches, seemed uncertain whether they ought to begin the next set. Every mother in Hertfordshire had rehearsed this scene in her mind for weeks. The Duke would cross the floor. He would bow to Seraphina Marchbanks, the season's undisputed diamond, and the betrothal everyone had gossiped about since April would finally be spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Lady Fenimore had even ordered extra cases of champagne sent up from the cellar that morning, certain the evening would end in a toast. Seraphina lowered her lashes, tilted her chin exactly the way her dance master had taught her for exactly this purpose, and waited for the Duke's shadow to fall across her skirts. It did not come. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft as wind through wheat, because the Duke had not stopped in front of Seraphina at all. He had walked past her, past the cluster of admiring young men who had spent the whole evening angling for her attention, past Lady Fenimore's own outstretched hand of introduction, and straight toward the far wall, where the candlelight barely reached and the shadows pooled thick behind a row of potted ferns. There, half hidden behind that fern and a marble column, stood Lynette Marchbanks in a grey dress 3 seasons old, its hem carefully let down twice already to hide how short it had become. A small leather ledger book was still tucked absurdly beneath her arm, because she had forgotten, in her nervousness, to leave it in the carriage as her mother had instructed twice. She was the quiet one, the forgotten one. The sister nobody introduced first, whose name people mixed up with the housemaids, whose presence in a room was so unremarkable that hostesses sometimes forgot to count her for supper. She had come tonight only because her mother insisted someone sensible chaperone Seraphina's triumph, someone to fetch shawls and remember names and stand quietly out of the way. Lynette looked up from the ledger she had been anxiously smoothing, and found the Duke of Ashcombe standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small white scar above his left eyebrow, and the entire ballroom went, silent enough to hear a single dropped glove strike the polished floor. The only person who did not appear surprised for long was Percival. His first shock vanished beneath the pleasant expression he wore as habitually as a cravat, but the hand around his champagne stem tightened until his knuckles showed white. Lynette noticed because Lynette noticed everything. It was the smallest of details, easily lost in the spectacle, yet it lodged somewhere in the back of her mind. She remembered seeing that same fixed smile at a card party in Hertfordshire after a young gentleman abruptly ended his attentions to Serafina. She remembered, too, the Duke's quiet irritation weeks earlier over charges in his London accounts that seemed too small to justify anger and too repetitive to be accidental. None of those observations formed a conclusion yet. They were merely figures waiting for the rest of the column. Linnet had lived long enough among careless people to know that truth often announced itself first through what everyone else dismissed as insignificant. Near the refreshment table, a lean, elegantly dressed gentleman with pale eyes and a fixed, pleasant smile went suddenly very still. His name was Percival Vane, the Duke's second cousin, and for 11 months he had managed the Ashcombe accounts in the Duke's frequent absences, and for 11 months he had prayed, quietly and fervently, that his cousin would choose a bride too dazzled by beauty and title to ever look closely at a ledger. He set down his glass of champagne without drinking from it. The Duke's hand remained extended. Linnet finally slid the small ledger from beneath her arm and placed it in his palm. It was not, in fact, the same estate volume he had found in his study months earlier. This one was her own pocketbook, its leather softened by years of use. But the gesture seemed to confirm something for him. His thumb passed once over the worn edge, and his expression altered almost imperceptibly. Recognition. Not of the object, perhaps, but of the habits behind it. The tiny annotations, the folded slips, the columns arranged with a precision no one in her family had ever valued enough to recognize. Linnet felt exposed in a way no fashionable gown could have made her feel. A face could be praised or dismissed. A mind once seen clearly was harder to hide again. "Miss Marchbanks," the Duke said, and his voice did not waver, did not search the room for correction, did not glance even once toward the more obvious sister, standing 11 feet away in ivory silk beneath the chandelier's full light. "I believe you have something of mine." Behind the Duke, Serafina's humiliation was visible only to someone who knew her well. Her smile did not collapse. Lady Marchbanks had trained that smile too carefully for such a public failure. Instead, the smallest line appeared between her brows. Her fingers closed around her fan. For the first time that evening, she looked not at the Duke, but at Linnet, and in her expression Linnet saw something more complicated than jealousy, bewilderment, fear, and the first faint recognition that a story Serafina had been promised since childhood might not belong to her after all. Linnet wanted absurdly to cross the floor and apologize. The instinct was so familiar she nearly obeyed it. Then the Duke said her name again, quietly and without embarrassment, and the apology died unspoken. Whatever happened after this, she understood dimly. She could not continue making herself smaller, merely to preserve everyone else's expectations. Linnet's mouth went dry as chalk dust. She had no idea what he could possibly mean. She had never spoken more than a handful of sentences to this man in her entire life, and most of those had concerned drainage ditches and tenant rent schedules rather than anything a young lady was meant to discuss with a duke. Behind her, she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, heard Serafina's soft, disbelieving laugh cut off mid-sound like a candle pinched between two fingers, heard the collective held breath of 200 people who had come tonight expecting a very different, far tidier story than the one now unfolding in front of them. The Duke extended his gloved hand, not toward her waist for a dance, but palm upward, patient, waiting. "Your ledger, Miss Marchbanks," he said quietly, so only she and the nearest dozen guests could hear the words. "The one with my estate's numbers corrected in the margins, in a hand, I have never been able to place. Someone left it in my study 3 months ago, unsigned and unexplained. I have spent 3 months trying to find the person clever enough and honest enough to have written it." Lady Marchbanks, meanwhile, had enough experience of society to understand that a public surprise became dangerous only when the family reacted as though it were a disaster. She crossed the few feet towards Serafina with measured calm, murmured something about the warmth of the room, and adjusted a bracelet that required no adjustment. To strangers, it looked maternal. To her daughters, it was an order. "Hold your positions." Serafina obeyed. Linnet nearly did. But the Duke was still standing before her, unconcerned by the dozens of eyes measuring the insult his movement had apparently delivered to convention. That steadiness gave Linnet an unfamiliar kind of courage. For once, the disruption in the room had not been caused by her error, and she did not have to repair it. The room did not breathe. Serafina's face, a moment ago glowing with the certainty of a life about to change, had gone the pale colour of chalk. Lady Marchbanks pressed a gloved hand to her own throat. And Lynette Marchbanks, who had spent her entire life being the girl no one looked at twice, stood frozen beneath the chandelier with 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her at once, and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that whatever came next would either save her family or destroy whatever fragile piece remained of it completely. 3 months earlier, the Marchbanks family had been drowning quietly, the way genteel families in Regency England so often drowned, behind lace curtains and unpaid tradesmen's bills that arrived wrapped in polite, terrifying language. Rosemont Hall, their crumbling manor in Hertfordshire, had not turned a proper profit since Lynette's grandfather gambled away half the tenant farms in a single disastrous winter at White's Club, a story the family never spoke of at table, but which hung over every room like damp in the plaster. Her father, Sir Reginald Marchbanks, was a kind man and a hopeless one, the sort who signed papers without reading them and smiled at creditors as though good manners alone could settle a debt. Her mother, Lady Marchbanks, had built her entire strategy for survival around one asset: Seraphina's face. If Seraphina married well, the family would be saved. Everything in that household, every gown, every dance lesson, every carefully rationed beeswax candle existed to polish that single hope brighter and brighter until it could blind a duke. Rosemont's decline had not arrived as one grand disaster. It came by inches. A tenant roof left unmended until rain ruined the rafters, a field leased at the wrong rate, a grain merchant permitted to delay payment because Sir Reginald disliked unpleasant conversations. Lynette learned early that ruin was often simply negligence repeated long enough. She also learned that people behaved differently when they believed no one important was listening. Tradesmen explained matters plainly in front of her because they assumed she would not understand. Stewards complained about her father's instructions because they assumed she had no authority to repeat them. From those fragments, she built an education more practical than anything her governess had been permitted to teach. She knew what a bushel of wheat should fetch after a poor harvest, how long clay soil could remain waterlogged before seed failed, and exactly how many weeks a family could postpone paying a creditor before courtesy sharpened into threat. None of it was knowledge a young gentlewoman was expected to possess, which made it all the more useful. Lynette had understood her place in the household by the age of 10. She was not ugly precisely, but beside Seraphina she simply disappeared, the way a candle disappears beside the sun at noon. She had brown hair that would not hold a curl, no matter how long the maid worked the tongs, a narrow, watchful face, and eyes the colour of strong tea that people rarely looked into long enough to notice were unusually sharp and steady. What Lynette possessed instead of beauty was numbers. She had taught herself arithmetic from her late grandmother's old account books, hidden away in the nursery after lessons finished, because no one in the house thought to stop her or even to ask what she did with her afternoons. By 14, she understood compound interest better than the family's own solicitor. By 17, she had quietly begun correcting the estate ledgers her father left carelessly scattered across his desk, writing in a small, careful hand in the margins, and no one in the house ever noticed the corrections were saving them money, because no one in the house ever looked closely at anything Lynette touched. Mrs. Abbott was the first person to treat that knowledge as something other than an oddity. On winter afternoons when the kitchen accounts were finished, and Lady Marchbanks believed Lynette to be practicing watercolours, the housekeeper would set 2 cups of tea at the end of the servants' table and ask, with studied casualness, whether Miss Lynette thought the butcher's latest bill looked honest. Lynette would pretend to consider it for the first time. Mrs. Abbott would pretend not to notice how quickly she found the error. Their quiet conspiracy gave Lynette something she had rarely experienced elsewhere: the dignity of being useful without being exploited. When Mrs. Abbott spoke of Ashcombe Park and the new Duke's determination to repair what his father had neglected, Lynette listened with an interest she tried to disguise even from herself. Here, perhaps, was another person who understood that estates did not survive through titles or portraits, but through attention. It was Mrs. Abbott, the housekeeper, grey-haired and dry-humoured, who first told her about Ashcombe Park over a shared pot of tea in the servants' hall, a habit Lynette had never quite outgrown. The neighbouring estate, 12 miles distant across muddy Hertfordshire lanes, belonged to a duke rarely seen in society, a man whose own father had left the land in near ruin through drink and neglect, before dying of a fever 3 winters past. The new duke, it was whispered in the village shop and the churchyard alike, worked his own accounts late into the night and trusted almost no one, because everyone who had ever managed his family's money before him had stolen from it in small, patient increments over many years. Even now, Mrs. Abbott murmured, lowering her voice, folk in the village said the duke's own cousin, a smooth-tongued Mr. Vane who kept his London townhouse accounts, was rather too fond of fine waistcoats for a man whose salary was so modest. The March meeting in Ashcombe's estate office became impossible to forget because the Duke did something no one else ever did after she corrected him. He asked how she knew. Not whether she was certain, not who had taught her, not whether she ought to be concerning herself with such matters, but how. Lynette explained the drainage estimate. He moved a second chair to the desk. She sat only after a moment's hesitation, muddy gloves clenched in her lap, and showed him the duplicated labor charges and the inflated price of stone. The Duke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned the page and asked what she thought of the rent schedule. That question kept her there another 20 minutes. By the time she remembered propriety, the light had changed beyond the windows and the land agent was standing discreetly in the doorway, pretending not to have witnessed anything unusual. When Rosemont's steward fell dangerously ill that spring with a fever of his own, it was Lynette, not her father, who quietly rode out one grey afternoon to the parish office and arranged for Ashcombe's own land agent to temporarily oversee both estates' shared boundary drainage, a practical solution born from sheer necessity rather than any grand ambition. She never expected to meet the Duke himself. She certainly never expected, on a grey March afternoon with mud splattered up the hem of her oldest riding habit and her hair escaping its pins in the wind, to walk into the Ashcombe estate office searching for the land agent and find instead a tall, tired-looking man bent over ledgers at the desk, rubbing his eyes like a man who had not slept properly in a year. He looked up sharply. She apologized, mortified, and turned at once to leave. It was during a later visit to deliver boundary maps that the anonymous ledger came into existence. The Duke had been called away abruptly to deal with a tenant accident, leaving several account books open on the desk. Lynette should have closed them and gone. Instead, one impossible total caught her eye, then another. She told herself she would correct only the first. An hour later, the margins held neat calculations beside 6 suspicious entries, including 2 London invoices whose numbers were mathematically sound but commercially absurd. Hearing voices in the corridor, she panicked at the impropriety of having altered a Duke's private books and left without signing her name. In her haste, she forgot the slim copied ledger she had been using to check the totals. She realized the loss only after returning to Rosemont. Mortification prevented her from asking for it back. That misplaced book, left in Ashcombe's study in March, would become the quiet thread joining every part of what followed. "Wait," he said before she had taken a second step. "You're standing in my doorway looking at my numbers as though you thoroughly disapprove of them." She had blushed scarlet to the roots of her hair and admitted, before she could stop the words leaving her mouth, that his tenant rent calculations on the 3rd page were wrong by nearly £40, and that whoever had drawn up his drainage cost estimates had padded the figure outrageously. The Duke of Ashcombe had stared at her for a long, silent moment, as though genuinely uncertain whether to be offended. Then, astonishingly, he had laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, the first one, he later admitted, in the whole of that grim winter. The Duke, for his part, remembered those country conversations more clearly than Lynette guessed. He had inherited Ashcombe at 29 after watching his father reduce a rich estate to a maze of arrears. 3 years of repair had made him suspicious of effortless charm. Men who praised his judgment often wanted contracts. Relatives who praised his generosity often wanted loans. The plain young woman who arrived mud-spattered and told him, without introduction, that his drainage estimates were nonsense had therefore been startlingly restful company. She wanted nothing he could identify. Even when she was embarrassed, she did not flatter him. That absence of performance became memorable long before he understood why. That was the first conversation. There would be others over the following weeks, always brief, always accidental seeming at the boundary fence or the parish office, always about numbers and never once about anything a proper chaperone would have permitted an unmarried young woman to discuss alone with a duke. She never told her mother. She never told Seraphina. It was the only thing in her narrow, overlooked life that belonged entirely and privately to her, and she guarded it the way a starving woman guards a crust of bread, afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow cause it to vanish. Serafina Marchbanks was not cruel, not truly, though history would later be tempted to paint her that way for the sake of a tidier, simpler story. She was simply a girl who had been told her entire life that her face was a family's last remaining currency, and she had grown into that role the way a vine grows around whatever trellis it is given, without ever pausing to ask whether it wished to climb somewhere else entirely. She loved Lynette in the absent, assuming way people love furniture they have never once imagined might one day walk away from the room on its own. When their mother spent the household's last decent sum of ready money on a season gown for Serafina, rather than mending the leaking roof over the east wing, Serafina did not think it strange in the slightest. It had always been so, for as long as either of them could remember. She was the investment. Lynette was merely the ledger that quietly recorded what the investment cost the family each year. Serafina's beauty had been managed almost as carefully as Lynette managed accounts. Their mother knew which colors made copper hair burn brightest in candlelight, which dances displayed Serafina's neck to advantage, which hostesses ought to be flattered before invitations were requested. Serafina participated willingly because she had never been offered another language in which to understand her worth. Yet there were moments Lynette saw the strain beneath the polish. Before important dinners, Serafina sometimes sat at her dressing table after the maid had gone and stared at her own reflection with the expression of a soldier facing inspection. She could not afford a spot, a badly placed curl, an ungraceful answer. Everyone's security had been tied to her perfection so thoroughly that failure was not permitted to be human. Lynette envied the attention Serafina received, but she did not envy that particular burden. The rivalry, if it could even honestly be called that, was entirely one-sided, because only one sister knew it existed at all. Lady Marchbanks corrected Lynette's posture sharply at dinner and praised Serafina's laugh warmly in the very same breath, without ever noticing she had done either. When the vicar's elderly wife once remarked kindly enough that Lynette had a remarkably clever mind for figures, Lady Marchbanks had laughed lightly and replied, "Yes, well, someone in the family had to have a use besides being admired." And the whole table had chuckled along politely, and Lynette had smiled too, because smiling was so much easier than the alternative, and because some quiet, worn-down part of her, after 19 years of hearing such things, had genuinely begun to believe it was true and fair. The sisters had once been closer. As children, they built kingdoms from sheets in the nursery and whispered stories after the candles were extinguished. The division came gradually. Serafina was moved into a prettier bedchamber at 12, because visitors had begun remarking on her prospects. Lynette remained in the old nursery another year. Serafina received a French dancing master. Lynette was told the expense of 2 pupils was unnecessary. No single decision was cruel enough to protest, but together they taught both girls the roles they were expected to perform. Serafina learned to stand in the light. Lynette learned how to work in the rooms behind it. Neither understood that the other had also lost something. There was, that same spring, a small warning Lynette nearly missed entirely. Serafina had been courted briefly by a baronet's son, who withdrew his attentions abruptly after a single private conversation with Percival Vane at a card party, a conversation no one in the Marchbanks family ever learned the contents of. Serafina wept for 2 days, and then, with the particular resilience of a girl trained since childhood to recover quickly, dried her eyes and turned her attention toward London instead. Lynette, watching her sister's brief heartbreak from the edge of the room as always, noted quietly in the back of her mind that Mr. Vane seemed to appear at the edges of the family's fortunes rather more often than pure chance could easily explain, and then, as she did with most things that were not her direct concern, she set the thought aside and returned to her ledgers. After the baronet's son withdrew, Lynette found Serafina crying in the linen room because it was the only place their mother would not immediately come looking for her. Serafina's face was blotched, her famous curls unpinned, and for once she looked not like the season's future diamond, but like the frightened girl who had once hidden beneath Lynette's blankets during thunderstorms. Lynette sat beside her without asking questions. After a long silence, Serafina said, "Do you ever wonder whether anyone would still want you if the one thing everyone praised disappeared?" Lynette nearly laughed at the cruel symmetry of the question. Instead she said, "Yes." Serafina looked at her then, perhaps expecting explanation, but footsteps sounded in the passage and the moment closed. it would be months before either sister understood how much truth had passed between them in that single word. What no one in the family knew, what Lynette herself barely admitted, even to her own reflection in the cracked nursery-looking glass, was that Rosemont Hall's continued existence depended almost entirely on her tireless, invisible labor. She had, over 3 quiet years, renegotiated 2 tenant leases her father would have carelessly let lapse into total ruin, discovered that their previous steward had been steadily stealing grain sale profits for nearly a decade, and personally calculated a repayment schedule for her father's old gambling debt to a moneylender in Hartford that kept the family from utter public disgrace by the narrowest possible margin imaginable. She did this exhausting work in stolen hours, by guttering candle stubs long after the household slept, in a hand carefully disguised to resemble her father's own whenever a document required a signature no one downstairs would think to question. She asked for nothing in return for any of it. She expected nothing. Lynette's invisible work became more demanding as Rosemont weakened. She began rising before the household to review rent receipts and remaining awake after midnight to draft letters for her father's signature. Twice she walked 3 miles to speak with tenants because there was no money to spare a horse. Once she sold a small garnet brooch left by her grandmother and entered the proceeds into the household books as an adjustment in grain sales, so her mother would not know the money had come from her. These sacrifices did not make her saintly. Some nights she resented every person sleeping peacefully above her while she balanced figures alone. What frightened her was how quickly resentment could be swallowed by habit. She had become so practiced at solving other people's emergencies that she no longer knew what an ordinary 19-year-old girl might have wanted for herself. It had simply never once occurred to her that a different life might be genuinely available to a girl who looked like her, plain and unremarkable in a family built entirely around beauty. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the numbers finally balanced and the candle burned low, she sometimes allowed herself a single small indulgence. She imagined just for a moment what it might feel like to be thanked. Not admired, not praised for a pretty laugh or a graceful turn about the room, simply thanked plainly by someone who understood exactly what the work had cost her. She never lingered on the thought for long. It felt dangerous, the way wanting things always felt dangerous to a girl raised to believe her only proper role was to want nothing at all, and she would close the ledger, snuff the candle, and rise the next morning exactly as unremarkable as she had been the day before, because that, she told herself, was simply the shape of her life, and there was no particular use in resenting the shape of a thing that could not be changed. There were costs to Serafina's role that money never recorded. She had learned to eat lightly before balls so her gowns sat correctly, to laugh at jokes she did not find amusing, and to remember the hobbies of men whose names blurred together by the end of an evening. Her mother called these skills accomplishments. Sometimes they felt like another form of accounting, except Serafina was both the clerk and the asset being valued. The tragedy between the sisters was not that one had everything and the other nothing. It was that each had been taught to envy the prison built for the other. Then came April, and with it the long-awaited invitation to London for the season, and with it, close on its heels, the quiet catastrophe that would change absolutely everything the family believed about itself. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered by a hard-faced clerk who refused the offer of tea and would not even sit in the good parlour chair. Sir Reginald's gambling debt, the very one Lynette had spent 3 exhausting years managing quietly down to a survivable trickle of monthly payments, had been sold outright. The moneylender in Hartford, weary of slow repayment, had transferred the note to a London solicitor representing a far less patient creditor, a sharp-eyed man named Josiah Crane, who dealt in ruined genteel families the way other men dealt casually in horses at Tattersall's. The new terms demanded full payment, £1,100 within 90 days, or Rosemont Hall itself, mortgaged years earlier entirely without Lynette's knowledge or her father's careful explanation, would be seized in full and sold at auction to the highest bidder. The 90-day demand changed the atmosphere of Rosemont overnight. Servants began speaking in lowered voices. Sir Reginald avoided the west windows because from there he could see the fields that might soon belong to a stranger. Lady Marchbanks ordered that no tradesman be admitted through the front entrance and doubled down on preparations for London as though silken invitations were weapons of war. Serafina submitted to fittings without complaint, but once Lynette found her staring at the unpaid seamstress's bill with a white, exhausted face. "If I fail," she said, not looking up. "What happens to everyone?" Lynette wanted to tell her the truth, that no marriage should carry the weight of 30 servants, 12 tenant families, a mortgaged house, and their father's shame. Instead, she folded the bill and said, "We are not going to let one person carry all of it." Serafina misunderstood the promise as comfort. Lynette meant it literally. Sir Reginald wept openly in his study that terrible night, an old man's tears, undignified and frightening to overhear, even through a closed door. Lady Marchbanks did not weep at all. She simply looked across the cold drawing room at Serafina with the particular icy calculation of a woman who had spent 19 patient years quietly building toward exactly this emergency, and said, in a voice that allowed no argument, "The season! We go to London! We go now, before the news of this reaches anyone's ears." Serafina, to her genuine credit, did not flinch at the weight suddenly placed on her shoulders. She understood the assignment instantly and completely, the way a soldier understands a direct order from a trusted commander. She would marry well and marry quickly, and the family would be saved by her hand alone, and if her own heart had any opinion at all on the matter, no one in that cold room thought for even a moment to ask it. Lynette spent the next 3 nights reconstructing the debt from documents her father had hidden among old correspondence. The mortgage was worse than she expected, but not hopeless. Rosemont still possessed 3 productive farms unencumbered by separate liens, timber rights along the northern boundary, and a lease due for renewal at a rate far below current value. The debt holder wanted speed more than land. Auctioning a country house involved delay, expense, and uncertainty. That fact became the first opening in Lynette's plan. If she could offer a higher total repayment over time, secured against income Crane could verify, she might convert his demand for immediate seizure into a transaction more profitable than destruction. It was cold arithmetic, but cold arithmetic had saved them before. Lynette said nothing whatsoever during the tense family conference, curled small into the window seat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, invisible as always in every corner of every room she entered. She watched her father's shoulders shake, watched her mother's jaw tighten with each fresh calculation, watched Serafina absorb the weight of the family's entire future without a single word of protest, and felt, not for the first time, the strange loneliness of being the only person in the room who understood the actual arithmetic of their ruin. But that night, alone at last in her narrow bed, she lit a single candle stub and opened the estate ledger she had kept in careful secret for 3 long years, and understood something her frightened, grieving parents plainly did not. £1,100 could not possibly be raised through a fortunate marriage alone, not within 90 short days, not with the legal wedding settlements and property transfers. Such a respectable match would inevitably require to be properly drawn and signed. There was one obstacle she could not solve from Rosemont: credibility. A London creditor who made his fortune dismantling indebted families would not be impressed by a 19-year-old gentlewoman's careful columns. Lynette needed someone whose name would force him to read before he laughed. That realization brought the Duke unavoidably into the plan. She resisted it for an entire day. Asking his help would confirm every private fear she had about depending on a powerful man. Worse, it would turn the one relationship in her life built on intellectual equality into an appeal for rescue. In the end, she decided she would not ask him for money. She would ask only whether the proposal was sound and whether he knew a solicitor willing to transmit it without altering her figures. The distinction mattered fiercely to her. Someone would need to negotiate directly and cleverly with Josiah Crane himself, buy precious time, restructure the crushing debt into something survivable, find real leverage where none currently existed. It was precisely the kind of tangled problem Lynette had already solved 100 times in smaller, quieter miniature across 3 unseen years. It was also, unmistakably, painfully, not a problem anyone in her family would ever once think to hand to her directly. Before leaving for London, Lynette rode once more along Rosemont's southern fields. Spring had begun greening the hedges, and tenant children were setting sticks across a stream swollen by recent rain. She stopped near a cottage whose roof she had arranged to repair the previous autumn. The tenant's wife came out with a baby on her hip and thanked Sir Reginald for his generosity. Lynette smiled and accepted the misdirected gratitude as she always did. Yet as she rode away, the words hurt differently. If Rosemont were lost, it would not be merely a family humiliation. People who had never seen the mortgage papers would lose homes and work because of decisions made in rooms they never entered. That knowledge stripped the coming season of any romance. London was not a parade of gowns to Lynette, it was a deadline. She thought of the clerk's face as he had stood in their small entryway that morning, unmoved by her father's stammering apologies, and understood something crucial about the man who had sent him. Josiah Crane did not deal in sympathy. He dealt in numbers, in collateral, in the cold, provable arithmetic of what a debt was worth against what a family could be made to surrender. Sentiment would not move him. A well-turned ankle would not move him, and no amount of Seraphina's beauty, however dazzling, would ever appear anywhere on his ledger as an asset. Only a better number would move him, a repayment structured cleverly enough that refusing it cost him more than accepting it, and Lynette was, whatever else the world believed of her, unusually good at building better numbers. The journey to London gave Lynette hours to test the proposal against every objection Crane might raise. When the carriage wheels struck ruts, Seraphina slept against the squabs, and Lady Marchbanks reviewed invitation lists. Lynette kept a pencil hidden beneath her cloak and recalculated projected farm income on the back of an old calling card. If harvest prices fell by 10%, the schedule still worked. If timber fetched less than expected, the second-year payment could be covered by the renewed East lease. By the time London roofs appeared through the grey haze, she knew the plan not as hope, but as structure. That difference steadied her, so she decided quietly, alone in the candlelit dark, that she would solve it anyway, without waiting to be asked, exactly the way she had solved every other crisis in that house before it. She simply had no idea yet that solving it properly would require walking straight back into the path of the one man in all of England who had ever looked at her columns of careful numbers before he ever once looked at her face. London in April was a city of endless noise and mud and dazzling, exhausting candlelight, and Seraphina bloomed inside it exactly the way she had been carefully engineered to bloom since girlhood. Within 2 short weeks, she had attracted 3 suitors of genuinely respectable fortune and one persistent, entirely unwanted admirer, twice her age with breath like stale sherry. Lady Marchbanks moved through crowded drawing rooms like a seasoned general reviewing a decisive campaign, and for a hopeful fortnight it seemed the family's rescue might arrive exactly on schedule after all. Lynette trailed quietly behind them at every single event, dressed in remade gowns turned carefully at the seams, introduced last if she was introduced at all, and used the long hours everyone assumed she wasted on idle needlework to do something far more dangerous and far more consequential. She wrote directly to Josiah Crane's solicitor, under the careful guise of managing her father's neglected correspondence, and began, patiently, to build a written case for why immediate seizure of Rosemont Hall would net Crane considerably less profit than a properly structured repayment plan would over time. The Marchbanks rented 3 cramped rooms in a respectable but unfashionable house near Grosvenor Square, close enough to society to be invited and far enough from extravagance to remain just within their means. Seraphina and Lady Marchbanks attended breakfasts, calls, exhibitions, routes, and balls until even Seraphina's remarkable energy began to fray. Lynette accompanied them when propriety demanded and stayed behind whenever she could plausibly plead a headache. Those stolen afternoons became her working hours. She visited a public reading room to consult price lists, copied rates from agricultural reports, and spent money she could scarcely spare on paper of a quality a London solicitor would not dismiss at first glance. Each evening she hid the developing proposal beneath the lining of her trunk. Their small rented rooms on Wimpole Street were nothing like Rosemont Hall's faded grandeur, 3 cramped chambers above a milliner's shop, where the smell of starch and dye drifted up through the floorboards each morning. And Lynette often worked at a corner writing desk by the grey London light because candles there were dearer than at home, and every penny still mattered enormously. It was at the Hollingsworth Musicale, 3 exhausting weeks into the season, that Lynette saw the Duke of Ashcombe again for the first time since arriving in London. He was seated near the very back of the crowded music room, clearly enduring the evening's tedious performance rather than genuinely enjoying it. And when their eyes met unexpectedly across the room during a particularly long violin passage, something passed silently between them that neither of them had planned and neither could easily name aloud. The Duke's presence at the Hollingsworth musical unsettled her because Hertfordshire had made him seem almost ordinary. In London, surrounded by people who calculated rank as naturally as breath, the distance between them became visible again. Mothers watched him. Debutantes adjusted their posture when he entered. Men with titles of their own made room for him without appearing to do so. Lynette had almost convinced herself that their conversations over drainage ditches belonged to another world until he crossed the music room during an interval and asked, with maddening calm, whether she had discovered any new errors in the nation's finances since coming to town. She laughed before she could stop herself. Several nearby heads turned. He crossed the room afterward during the brief interval and found her exactly where she had deliberately positioned herself behind a marble column, well out of the main current of chattering guests. "Miss Marchbanks," he said quietly, "you have the distinct look of a woman doing careful arithmetic in her head during a Handel sonata." She admitted, because lying to him had never once genuinely occurred to her in all their conversations, that she was in fact calculating compound interest on a debt that was not technically hers to solve alone. He did not laugh this time as he once had over drainage figures. He simply listened with the full, unhurried attention he seemed to reserve only for numbers and apparently for her. Their conversation moved from music to grain tariffs and then, inevitably, to Rosemont. Lynette did not reveal the debt, but she asked whether a creditor might prefer a secured long-term return to the expense of foreclosure. The Duke's amusement disappeared. He answered carefully, outlining the factors such a creditor would weigh, then asked why she wanted to know. "Curiosity," Lynette said. His gaze rested on her for a beat too long. "You are rarely curious without a practical reason." It was the first time anyone had described her habits back to her with accuracy. She felt, absurdly, more exposed by that observation than she would have been by a declaration of admiration. Across the room, Percival watched. He had expected his cousin's eventual marriage to be socially useful and administratively harmless. Seraphina, dazzling and trained for display, fit that expectation perfectly. Lynette did not. He had already heard from a groom at Ashcombe that the quiet Marchbanks girl discussed estate drainage with the Duke. Now he saw the Duke listening to her with the grave attention he usually reserved for lawyers. Percival understood danger not as dramatic revelation, but as the accumulation of small probabilities. A woman who could read accounts, who had access to his cousin, and who seemed indifferent to flattery represented an intolerable combination. That evening he began asking who in the Marchbanks household might be persuaded to talk. She told him nothing at all of the exact amount or the creditor's actual name, only the general shape and urgency of the problem, and he asked 3 questions in return so precise, so immediately and obviously useful, that she realized with a small private jolt he had once faced something painfully similar himself on his own father's ruined and neglected estate. "Crane is a known name in certain circles," he said finally quietly, leaning slightly closer so the words would not carry. "He is endlessly patient with numbers on a page and utterly merciless with reputations in a drawing room. If your family's difficulty becomes widely known before you have properly negotiated new terms, he will smell weakness at once and refuse to bend even an inch. Say nothing further to anyone you do not fully trust. Move quickly and move quietly." It was the first genuine piece of practical advice anyone in her entire life had ever given her that plainly assumed without a shred of doubt that she was fully capable of acting on it herself. When Lynette finally sent her restructuring proposal through a junior solicitor recommended indirectly by the Duke, she signed it with her own name. The decision took longer than drafting the document. For years she had hidden behind her father's signature because a man's name made doors open. Now she wrote Lynette Marchbanks beneath the final page and stared at the ink until it dried. If Crane rejected it, she wanted the rejection to belong to her. If he accepted, she wanted that to belong to her as well. She did not yet recognize the gesture as the beginning of a larger rebellion. It felt merely like accuracy. She did not tell him, in that quiet interval, that it was in fact her own father's shameful debt. She did not need to say it aloud. Something steady and understanding in his dark expression told her he had already guessed the whole truth of it and had simply chosen, out of a rare and careful kindness, not to say so aloud himself, which was its own quiet gift to a woman so unused to receiving any at all. Walking home that night through streets slick with a fine April rain, the lamplight smearing gold across the wet cobblestones, Lynette found herself smiling for no reason she could easily explain to her mother, who walked beside her complaining pleasantly about the thinness of the Hollingsworth's orgeat. It was not romance, or not only romance, though something in her chest had certainly stirred at the low, private register of his voice. It was something closer to relief, the particular loosening in the shoulders that comes from being believed capable by someone whose opinion could not be bought or flattered. She had spent 19 years being managed, arranged, and quietly overlooked. Being consulted, even briefly, even in a crowded interval between musical sets, felt like stepping into a room she had not known existed inside her own life. The strange result of London was that the Duke and Lynette became more formal in public and more candid whenever a room accidentally gave them privacy within sight of others. At assemblies he called her Miss Marchbanks and bowed with exact propriety. Near a library shelf or beside an open terrace door, he asked whether she had slept, whether the proposal had advanced, whether she had remembered that a person could become as exhausted from preventing disaster as from enduring it. Lynette had no practice answering such questions. Competence was easier to discuss than weariness. Yet she began to understand that his attention was not confined to what she could solve. Across the room, Percival Vane watched the pair of them with pale, unreadable eyes and began very quietly to make inquiries of his own about the plain Marchbanks sister. Rumours in a London season travel faster than any well-sprung carriage, and by the 5th exhausting week of the season, one had begun circulating through Mayfair's drawing rooms that would very nearly destroy everything Lynette had so carefully built in silence. It began, though Lynette would not learn this for weeks, in a private conversation between Percival Vane and a housemaid he had bribed with 2 shillings and the promise of a reference. A young woman who had noticed the plain Marchbanks sister meeting privately, twice now, with the notoriously reclusive Duke of Ashcombe near the boundary hedge at Rosemont months earlier. Percival had listened to the girl's small, harmless account and reshaped it with the practiced skill of a man who had spent 11 months quietly reshaping numbers in his cousin's ledgers into something considerably more dangerous. The rumour reached Lynette not through a friend, but through silence. At a morning call, 2 young women who had previously ignored her entirely stopped speaking when she entered. At a bookseller's, a matron looked from Lynette to Seraphina with open curiosity. That evening, a gentleman who had once asked Lynette's opinion of a pamphlet bowed to her sister and pretended not to see Lynette standing beside her. She might have dismissed each incident alone. Together, they formed a pattern. By the time Seraphina confronted her, Lynette had already understood that someone was writing a story about her and distributing it faster than she could possibly correct it. The story that spread through the ton was not the true one at all. It was uglier by far, and considerably more entertaining to a bored, gossip-hungry drawing room. That Lynette Marchbanks, consumed with jealousy over her sister's dazzling success, had schemed deliberately to trap a duke through secret assignations, cynically using her family's genuine desperation as a convenient excuse to throw herself shamelessly at a man far, far above her modest station in life. Seraphina heard it first, from a supposed friend who delivered the news with poorly disguised delight over afternoon tea, and for one terrible, blinding hour, she believed every word of it completely. Seraphina's anger came from a wound Lynette had not fully understood. The possibility that the Duke might prefer Lynette was painful, but the secrecy hurt more. "You knew him before London," Seraphina said. "You had something that was yours, and you never told me." There was accusation in the words, but also grief. Seraphina had spent her life believing she possessed everything Lynette lacked: attention, opportunity, confidence, without realizing Lynette might possess a private world from which Seraphina herself was excluded. Lynette almost told her then about the ledgers, the debt, the March conversations, all of it. But their father's shame stood between them like a locked door. Protecting him required Lynette to look guilty. She confronted Lynette directly in their shared dressing room that same evening, her voice shaking with a raw hurt that had almost nothing to do with cold logic and everything to do with 19 accumulated years of quietly assuming her plain younger sister harbored no private ambitions of her own left to betray. "You let me stand there at every single ball," Seraphina said, her voice breaking, "and believe this whole season was meant for both of us together, while you were secretly meeting a duke behind my very back." Lynette, stunned and completely cornered, could not possibly explain the crushing debt without revealing their beloved father's private shame to her sister, could not explain the Duke's involvement without sounding exactly as guilty as the cruel rumor already claimed her to be. For the very first time in her entire life, her practiced silence, always her safest armor, became instead her own inescapable prison. Lady Marchbanks made the situation worse by treating scandal as a mathematical problem with only one acceptable solution. Seraphina's reputation had greater market value. Therefore, Lynette must sacrifice hers to protect it. She instructed Lynette to avoid the Duke, decline invitations where he might be present, and, if necessary, encourage the impression that their acquaintance had been insignificant. "There are moments," her mother said, "when a sensible girl understands that being right matters less than being useful." Lynette heard the sentence and suddenly recognized the architecture of her entire life. She had been useful, in exactly that fashion for 19 years, by disappearing whenever her existence complicated someone else's plan. Lady Marchbanks was harsher still and colder. She did not raise her voice even once. She simply looked at Lynette with an expression of complete, icy disappointment and spoke the exact words that would echo painfully in Lynette's memory for years afterward. "I gave you nothing over the years because you asked me for nothing in return, and I foolishly assumed that meant you truly wanted nothing at all. It seems after everything I was gravely mistaken to ever trust the quiet ones among us." The sheer unfairness of it all, that the very daughter who had spent 3 grueling years secretly saving the entire family from ruin was now being publicly accused of destroying it. Instead, struck Lynette like a physical blow to the chest, and for one terrible, hollow night, she very nearly gave up on everything entirely, nearly let the careful ledgers close forever and the crushing debt collapse in Rosamond Hall fall exactly as everyone in that house seemed to secretly expect the quiet daughter's quiet efforts to fall, unnoticed, unrewarded, and finally completely erased from memory. That night she opened the hidden copy of Crane's letter and discovered that fear had become anger. The deadline had continued shrinking while London discussed whether she had looked too eagerly at a duke. Rosamond did not care about gossip. Interest accrued whether or not a drawing room approved of her. She took out a blank page and began listing the people who benefited from separating her from Ashcombe. Seraphina did not. Her mother wanted a marriage but had no access to the original hedge meetings. Crane cared only about payment. Percival's name remained. Beside it she wrote 2 facts. London account discrepancies. Baronet's son withdrew after speaking to him. For the first time, the scattered observations looked less like coincidence, but somewhere near a grey, exhausted dawn, staring hollow-eyed at her late grandmother's worn old account book by the last inch of candlelight, Lynette found something inside herself far harder and more durable than shame. She found genuine anger, quiet, carefully controlled, and entirely fiercely her own for the very first time. And beneath the anger, a small, cold, clear thought took root. Someone had wanted this rumor to spread, and someone had wanted it to spread specifically now, in the very weeks she was closest to solving her family's debt. Percival's calculation was almost correct. A lesser scandal would have driven the Marchbanks women from London, preserved Seraphina as the obvious ducal candidate, and removed Lynette from the accounts he feared she might examine. What he misjudged was the effect of humiliation on someone who had spent a lifetime absorbing it quietly. The rumor did not teach Lynette shame. She already knew shame too well. It taught her the limits of obedience. There are injuries that bend a person, and injuries that reveal the exact point beyond which bending becomes impossible. By the end of that week, Lynette had reached hers. She thought of every year she had spent making herself smaller, so the room would have space for Seraphina to shine. Every apology offered for a mistake that was never hers. Every quiet correction to a ledger no one thanked her for and understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that a lifetime of making herself small had not protected her from cruelty after all. It had only made the cruelty easier to aim. Somewhere in that realization was a decision, not yet fully formed, but present. The way the first grey light of dawn is present long before the sun itself clears the hedgerow. She would not make herself smaller again. Whatever came next, whatever it cost her with her mother, her sister, or the whole of London society, she intended to take up exactly as much space as the truth required. She rose the very next morning and did not apologize to a single soul in the household. This fact alone, more than anything else that followed, deeply unsettled the family, because Lynette's constant small apologies had always been the household's quiet background music, as steady and unremarkable as English rain against the window panes. Instead, she sat her stunned father down firmly in his own study, laid out 3 full years of meticulous ledgers he had genuinely never once bothered to read himself, and showed him, patiently, line by careful line, exactly how close Rosemont Hall had come to complete ruin a full dozen separate times already, and exactly whose steady hand had quietly prevented every single disaster. Sir Reginald wept again that grey morning, but differently this time, the raw tears of a man finally realizing the plain daughter he had never truly bothered to see had been faithfully carrying his entire family for years without a single word of complaint. Sir Reginald's reaction to the ledgers was not immediate gratitude. First came disbelief, then shame, then the defensive instinct of a man discovering that his authority had been largely ceremonial. He turned pages too quickly, searching for an error that would make the revelation smaller. Linnet waited. Eventually he reached a winter 3 years earlier when the family had believed an unexpected grain payment had saved them from default. In the margin, Linnet had preserved the true explanation: renegotiated lease, delayed creditor, sale of personal brooch. Her father stopped turning pages. "You were 16, he said. Linnet nodded. The room seemed to age around him. "Why did you never once tell me any of this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because you never once asked me," Linnet said simply, and there was no real cruelty in the words at all, only a plain fact finally spoken aloud after 19 long years of careful, exhausting silence. She went to confront her mother next, and this particular conversation proved far harder still, because Lady Marchbanks did not weep in return. She argued sharply instead, insisting the rumour's social damage was already thoroughly done regardless of its actual truth, that a young lady's fragile reputation, once seriously questioned in society, could never simply be reasoned back into proper place through mere facts alone. When he asked why she had never trusted him with the truth, Linnet answered more gently than he deserved. "I tried at first. You told me not to trouble myself with estate matters. After that, it became easier to fix things than to persuade anyone they required fixing." Sir Reginald covered his face with both hands. She had imagined this moment many times during sleepless nights, imagined accusation, triumph, perhaps even revenge. Instead, she felt only exhaustion. Recognition, she discovered, could not restore the hours already spent alone. It could only change what happened next. "Then I will not bother reasoning it back into place at all," Linnet said, standing her ground for perhaps the first time in her entire life. "I will instead prove it wrong with cold, hard facts, exactly the same careful way I have proven every single debt in this house wrong for 3 straight years." For the first time in her living memory, her proud mother looked at her not with the usual familiar disappointment, but with something entirely new and closer to startled, dawning recognition, as though truly seeing, very belatedly, a capable daughter who had been quietly standing in the room all along. "There is something else," Linnet added, choosing her words with care. "I do not believe this rumor began by accident. Someone shaped it deliberately, and shaped it to strike now, of all weeks. I intend to learn who." Her mother's reckoning was slower. Lady Marchbanks stood in the doorway during part of the conversation and listened without entering. Later, when Linnet returned to her room, she found a new packet of candles on the desk. Good beeswax candles, the sort always reserved for Seraphina's dressing room. No note accompanied them. Linnet almost laughed. Her mother was not yet ready to apologize in words, so she had supplied better light for the work she had spent years pretending did not matter. It was inadequate and strangely moving at once. The next morning, Linnet sent Crane the final revised proposal bearing her own signature and requested written confirmation that negotiations were active, which would delay any attempt at immediate seizure. Then she wrote to the Duke. She did not ask him to rescue Rosemont. She asked for an interview because she believed someone with access to Ashcombe's accounts had manufactured the rumor, and because the same person might be stealing from him. It was the boldest letter she had ever written. She sanded the page, sealed it, and experienced no regret. Sir Reginald, still hollow-eyed from his own reckoning that morning, surprised her by rising from his chair and crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "Your grandfather gambled away half of Rosemont and called it misfortune," he said quietly, "and I let it stay unmended and called it patience. And between the two of us, we very nearly handed you nothing at all to inherit but debt and a fading name. Whatever you intend to do next, Linnet, you will not do it alone. I may be a foolish old man, but I'm not so foolish that I cannot recognize when it is finally shown to me plainly which of my daughters has been holding this family together with her own 2 hands." It was not eloquent, and it was terribly overdue, but it was the first time in her life her father had spoken to her as though her decisions carried real weight, and something in Linnet's chest, tight and guarded for 19 years, loosened very slightly at the words. Seraphina appeared before the letter left. Her anger had cooled into something brittle. "Was any of it true?" she asked. Linnet answered carefully. She had spoken with the Duke in Hertfordshire about estate matters. She had not pursued him romantically. She had concealed the meetings because their mother would have forbidden them, and she had never intended to humiliate Serafina. "That is not everything," Serafina said. "No," Lynette replied, "but the rest is father's to tell you." It was the first boundary Lynette had ever set with her sister. Serafina hated it, yet she respected it enough not to break it. That small act of restraint would matter later. Lynette wrote directly to Josiah Crane's solicitor that very same afternoon, no longer hiding carefully behind her father's borrowed name, but signing the formal correspondence plainly and boldly as herself for the first time. She proposed a fully restructured repayment plan secured firmly against a parcel of Rosemont's least productive northern acreage, poor land. Crane's own people could sell off at a modest profit, while the family retained the ancestral house itself and its remaining productive tenant farms completely intact. It was, quite objectively, exactly the kind of sophisticated proposal a trained London solicitor would ordinarily need several careful weeks to properly construct from scratch. She had built the entire thing in a single furious, grief-sharpened night at her writing desk. Sir Reginald did one useful thing before the day ended. He called Serafina and Lady Marchbanks into the study and told them the mortgage was his responsibility. He did not allow his wife to call it family misfortune or his father-in-law's legacy. He described the documents he had signed, the notices he had ignored, and the burden Lynette had assumed because he would not. The confession did not restore his authority. It did something better. It made honesty possible inside Rosemont for the first time. Serafina listened with her hands locked together. Lady Marchbanks stared at the carpet. Lynette, exhausted, realized she was no longer the only person carrying the truth. And then, because the ugly rumor still hung stubbornly over the entire family like acrid smoke after a fire, she did the one remarkable thing she had never once done in 19 quiet years of careful accommodation. She requested, formally and in writing, a proper audience with the Duke of Ashcombe himself, not in secret this time, not hidden behind some convenient column at a musicale, but openly with her own mother present as a respectable chaperone, so that whatever plain truth existed between them could finally be spoken aloud where the whole of London might eventually come to hear it clearly. The Duke received them both in his townhouse's rarely used formal drawing room, a grand space so seldom entered it still smelled faintly of dust sheets and cold ash, and Lady Marchbanks sat rigid with poorly concealed anxiety, while Lynette, astonishingly even to herself, did not. She laid the entire ugly rumor before him plainly and without a single flinch, and asked him directly and boldly whether he intended to let the false story stand entirely uncorrected, since his continued public silence on the matter had done absolutely nothing to slow its steady spread through Mayfair's most fashionable drawing rooms. It was a remarkably bold question to ask a duke, bordering on genuine impropriety, exactly the sort of direct question the old timid Lynette would never once have dared voice aloud to anyone. Something shifted visibly and unmistakably in the Duke's careful expression as she asked it, a small flicker of something that looked remarkably, unmistakably like open admiration. The Duke received Lynette in a library whose windows stood open to a rare warm afternoon. A footman remained within sight and the door stayed properly ajar, concessions to propriety neither of them mentioned. Lynette had rehearsed her explanation in the carriage. She lost the rehearsed version within 2 minutes. He asked for facts, so she gave him facts. The bribed housemaid she suspected must exist. The timing of the rumor, Percival's conversation with Serafina's former admirer, the repeated small discrepancies in London invoices. The Duke did not dismiss any observation because it came from a woman or because it sounded socially improbable. He simply arranged them in order on a sheet of paper. "I've said nothing publicly," he admitted honestly, "because I assumed correcting the rumor myself would only fuel its spread further still." A duke publicly defending an unmarried woman's honor is, unfortunately, exactly the sort of delicious scandal fodder society enjoys most of all. He paused, studying her openly with an intensity of attention that made poor Lady Marchbanks shift uncomfortably in her stiff chair. "But you did not travel here today merely to ask me to defend you, did you, Miss Marchbanks? You came instead to tell me plainly that you intend to defend yourself completely, and you simply wish me to know it first, before anyone else." Then he surprised her by producing the slim ledger she had left in his study in March. "I wondered whether you would ever ask for this back," he said. Lynette stared at her own handwriting in horror. "I had hoped the floor had swallowed it." The floor has better judgment than that." His mouth shifted, almost a smile. He explained that he had recognized the same peculiar method in the margins of the proposal she had shown the solicitor. Totals checked twice, questionable entries marked not with accusations, but with small crosses, alternative figures written beneath. He had suspected the truth for weeks. He had said nothing because he wanted her to choose whether to claim the work herself. Lynette did not deny his words for a moment. Instead, she told him, plainly and without hesitation, about Josiah Crane, about the original 90-day deadline now shrunk to barely 5 remaining weeks, about the full restructured proposal she had personally drafted and already sent that very morning. Then, watching his face carefully, she told him her suspicion, that the rumor had not spread by accident, but had been deliberately shaped and released at precisely the moment it could do her the most harm. The Duke went very still. "Tell me exactly what the housemaid at Rosemont would have seen," he said slowly, "and tell me exactly who among my own household might have asked her about it." When Lynette described the timing and the small, oddly specific details woven through the rumor, details only someone who had spoken directly to a Rosemont servant could have known, the Duke's jaw tightened in a way she had never once seen before. The admission changed the space between them. Lynette had feared that being discovered would feel like exposure. Instead, it felt, unexpectedly, like permission. "You could have asked me," she said. "Yes." The Duke looked down at the ledger. "But I have spent most of my life being answered according to what people think a duke wishes to hear. I wanted to know what you would do when no one was asking." Lynette understood then why the anonymous corrections mattered to him. His father had left Ashcombe, full of men who praised him while stealing from the estate. An unsigned act of honesty had become, to a man trained to distrust motives, evidence of character. He also told her more about Percival. The cousin had been useful during a year of relentless travel, handling London bills and tradesmen while the Duke rebuilt the country estate. The sums missing were deliberately modest. £12 here, 19 there, an inflated invoice for wine, a duplicated payment to a tailor. Any one discrepancy could be clerical error. Together they suggested a system. The Duke's voice hardened as he spoke. "My father lost thousands because he preferred relatives to competent strangers. I thought knowing that history would make me immune to repeating it." Lynette answered, "History usually makes us confident about the wrong danger." He looked at her for a long moment, then laughed softly. "That may be the least comforting, sensible thing anyone has ever said to me." "My cousin Percival has managed my accounts for 11 months, he said, each word measured and cold. "I have twice found small discrepancies in the London household ledgers that I could not fully explain, and twice let them pass because I had no proof and no time to chase shadows. If he learned that a woman existed who could read a ledger the way you read one, Miss Marchbanks, and if he feared what such a woman might eventually find in mine, he would have every reason in the world to want you discredited before I ever thought to ask for your help directly." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to help you regardless, and I would like your help in return, if you're willing to give it. Not because your sister happens to be beautiful, and certainly not despite the plain fact that you were never quite what society expected anyone to notice in a crowded room, but because in 8 full months of quiet correspondence about drainage ditches and tenant leases, you have been the only person of my entire acquaintance who has never once asked me for a single thing in return." Before she left, he asked to see Crane's proposal. Lynette handed it over with reluctance. He read in silence, then returned to the first page and read again. "You do not need my money," he said finally. Relief rushed through her so quickly she nearly swayed. "No. You need his patience." The Duke suggested one alteration. Include a guarantee that timber sales would be independently valued, removing Crane's strongest excuse for rejecting the schedule. He offered to have his solicitor attest to the valuation, nothing more. Lynette accepted. The help preserved the thing she needed most, the knowledge that Rosemont would be saved by a plan she had built, not by becoming indebted to the man she was beginning, dangerously, to love. He told her then, briefly and without self-pity, what his own father's final years had looked like. A great house slowly emptied of its silver, tenant farms let to rack and ruin, and a young heir who had come home from his studies to find the estate's books in such disorder that it had taken him 3 full years of unglamorous, unwitnessed labor to set right, years no one in society ever asked him about because a duke's ledgers were assumed, by default, to be someone else's tedious concern. I have spent 5 years being complimented on my horses and my hunting, and never once on the actual work that kept Ashcombe standing, he said, with the dry, private humour of a man who had made peace with the unfairness of it long ago. I confess, Miss Marchbanks, I did not expect to meet the one other person in England who might understand precisely what that particular kind of invisible labour costs a person, and costs them gladly, because the alternative is watching everything you love collapse. Their discussion ended not with romance, but with work. The Duke rang for fresh ink, and for nearly an hour they reviewed the timber valuation clause together. He challenged one assumption. Lynette defended it with 3 years of Rosemont sale records. She questioned his solicitor's proposed wording. He admitted she was right and crossed it out. The ease of the exchange frightened her precisely because it felt ordinary. She could imagine a life made of such evenings: disagreement without dismissal, correction without wounded pride, silence without invisibility. That vision was far more dangerous than a handsome face or a grand title. It resembled partnership. Lady Marchbanks, watching this remarkable exchange unfold before her very eyes, understood with sudden, dizzying, humbling clarity that she had spent 19 long years carefully polishing entirely the wrong daughter for exactly this pivotal moment. The weeks that followed moved with the particular breathless speed of a story racing headlong toward its own inevitable collision. The Duke's carefully worded letter to Josiah Crane did precisely what he had confidently predicted it would. Within a single fortnight, Crane's own solicitor formally accepted the restructured repayment terms, and Rosemont Hall was, for the very first time in 3 long, anxious years, genuinely and provably safe from seizure. Quietly, and without a single word to his cousin, the Duke also set his own solicitor to work combing through 11 months of Ashcombe's London accounts, and within that same fortnight uncovered exactly what he had feared. Nearly £600 diverted through false tradesmen's invoices, the same patient, small increment theft that had nearly ruined his father's estate before him, practiced now by the very cousin he had trusted to prevent it. Crane's acceptance arrived on a rain-heavy morning. Sir Reginald read the letter twice, then handed it to Lynette without speaking because his voice had failed. Rosemont would remain theirs so long as the new schedule was met. The northern timber would be sold under independent valuation, 2 leases renewed at current rates, and quarterly payments made from farm income. It was not a miracle, it was better, a workable plan. Lynette folded the letter carefully and felt years of tension loosen from her shoulders by one narrow degree. There would still be work, but for the first time the future contained more than emergency. But this hard-won safety did not silence the lingering rumour, and Lady Fenimore's grand ball, the single most important event remaining on the season's crowded calendar, became, without anyone quite intending it to happen, the very stage on which the whole truth would finally have to be spoken aloud publicly, or else be buried forever in whispers. Seraphina, still visibly wounded, still genuinely uncertain whether to believe her own sister or the persistent poisonous whispers, arrived that evening determined to reclaim the night as her own personal triumph, exactly as everyone still stubbornly expected her to do. Percival Vane arrived too, smiling his fixed, pleasant smile, entirely unaware that the ledgers bearing his careful forgeries now sat locked in his cousin's writing desk. The same week, Ashcombe's solicitor confirmed the theft. The evidence was tedious rather than dramatic: false invoices, altered dates, payments routed through a tradesman who existed only as a rented address in Clerkenwell. Lynette found the banality almost offensive. So much damage created not by brilliance, but by the assumption that no one would look closely. The Duke chose not to confront Percival privately before Fenimore's ball. If warned, his cousin might destroy correspondence or flee without settling what he owed. Instead, the solicitor secured the relevant records while the Duke behaved in public exactly as usual. Percival, believing the rumour had successfully isolated Lynette, relaxed enough to attend the ball. It was Seraphina herself in the end who finally broke the unbearable tension no one else in that glittering room quite dared to touch. Standing near the crowded refreshment table, barely an hour before the Duke's own arrival was even formally announced, she overheard 2 fashionable matrons repeating the old cruel rumour, with fresh, spiteful embellishments added for effect, and something in her own sister's stricken, wounded expression from weeks earlier came flooding back to her all at once, far sharper than any idle gossip could ever be. "That is simply not what happened at all," Serafina said, loudly enough that 3 separate nearby conversations stopped cold to listen. "My own sister quietly saved our entire family while the rest of us were busy dancing and preening. If anyone in this room owes a genuine apology tonight, it is certainly not her." Serafina's change began before the ballroom. Sir Reginald finally told her the full truth about the debt and Lynette's work. She listened in complete silence. When he finished, she went directly to Lynette's room, where the grey gown for Fenimore's ball lay across the bed. "You let me think I was saving us," Serafina said. Lynette braced for anger. "Mother let us both think it," Serafina continued. "You were saving us, and I was being displayed like a horse at Tattersall's, and somehow we were taught to resent each other for it." Then she picked up Lynette's gown and frowned at the frayed trimming. Without another word, she opened her own jewel case and removed a narrow silver ribbon from a spare sash. Together, awkwardly at first, they remade the neckline. It was the first thing they had created side by side since childhood. At Fenimore House, Serafina noticed the gossip before Lynette did. 2 matrons near the refreshment table repeated the story with new details: secret midnight meetings, forged letters, even an invented attempt by Lynette to sabotage her sister's gowns. The absurdity should have made it harmless. Instead, Serafina saw Lynette across the room, standing alone near the ferns while people glanced toward her and away. For the first time, Serafina understood what invisibility looked like when weaponized. She had benefited from rooms arranging themselves around her all her life. She could use that same attention now. So she crossed the ballroom, placed herself where everyone could hear, and contradicted the rumor with the full force of the social authority she had once taken for granted. It was the very first time in either sister's shared life that Serafina had deliberately used her considerable social standing to openly defend Lynette rather than casually eclipse her, and the sheer shock of it rippled through the crowded room nearly as forcefully as anything the Duke himself would do a mere hour later. Lady Marchbanks, standing quietly nearby, said absolutely nothing at all in that charged moment, but reached instinctively for Serafina's gloved hand and held it firmly, a silent, powerful acknowledgement passing wordlessly between mother and daughter that no amount of vicious London gossip could ever hope to undo now. Her defense did more than protect Lynette. It freed Serafina herself. The moment she declared that her sister had saved the family, she publicly rejected the role in which her beauty was supposed to be Rosemont's only valuable asset. Lady Marchbanks understood immediately. The hand she closed around Serafina's was not merely maternal gratitude. It was an apology to both daughters for having reduced them to functions. One face, one ledger. No speech could undo 19 years, but the family stood together in that crowded room differently than they had entered it. When the Duke of Ashcombe finally arrived and began crossing the crowded ballroom floor, he paused first, deliberately, before his cousin. "Percival," he said, pleasantly enough for the surrounding guests to hear nothing amiss, "you will call at my solicitor's office tomorrow morning. We have accounts to discuss." The colour drained entirely from Percival Vane's face, and he understood, in that single unhurried sentence, that his 11 months of careful theft and his clumsy attempt to bury an honest woman's reputation had both finally come to their end. He set down his glass a second time that evening, and this time his hand was not entirely steady, and he found, when he looked around the glittering room for some ally to receive his practiced smile, that every face nearby had already half turned away, the way rooms full of fashionable people always somehow sensed, before the words were even spoken aloud, exactly which way a man's fortunes were about to fall. Before leaving for Fenimore House, Lady Marchbanks came to Lynette's room carrying the family pearls. Lynette assumed they were meant for Serafina and began to say so. Her mother stopped her. "I have spent years dressing one daughter as though the other required no adornment," she said, each word apparently costing her. "I cannot repair that with pearls, but I can stop repeating it." Lynette did not wear the necklace. It was too grand for the grey gown and too heavy with meaning. She chose instead a single pearl pin at her throat. Her mother fastened it with trembling fingers. It was the first apology between them, spoken partly in words and partly in touch. The candles overhead burned low and gold, throwing long shadows across the polished floor, and somewhere beneath the music, the low hum of 200 private conversations had gone strangely, expectantly quiet. The particular hush of a room that senses correctly that it is about to witness something worth remembering for years afterward. The room's collective assumption, carefully built over many months of breathless speculation, still fully expected the Duke to stop precisely before Serafina's ivory silk and famous copper curls. Lynette, standing quietly near the far wall with her forgotten ledger still tucked absurdly beneath her arm, expected exactly the same outcome. It did not happen that way at all. He walked straight past the glowing golden center of the room and came to a complete stop directly in front of the quiet one instead. "Your ledger, Miss Marchbanks," the Duke said again, his voice softer now, the same formal words from that very first opening moment finally revealing their full and complete weight to everyone gathered and listening breathlessly. "I found it in my study exactly 3 months ago. Unsigned, entirely uninvited, and yet more honest by far than anything a single paid steward had ever shown me in 3 long years. I've been quietly trying to find its true author ever since that day, and I confess I did not fully expect, when I finally did find her at last, that I would also discover the single bravest woman I have ever met in my entire life." The ballroom, so very recently poised to celebrate an entirely different engagement altogether, understood at last that it was witnessing something it had never once correctly predicted, and the profound silence that followed was not cruel, as such heavy silences so often were in that particular glittering world, but something considerably closer to genuine collective awe. For all the room's certainty, the Duke's proposal was not a rescue. That distinction mattered to Lynette. Rosamond had already been saved. Percival's fraud had already been uncovered. She did not need a title to vindicate her intelligence, nor a marriage to protect her family from Crane. For the first time in her life, the question before her was not what necessity required, but what she wanted. The realization frightened her more than debt ever had. Numbers offered correct answers. Desire did not. She looked at the Duke's outstretched hand and remembered him muddy at the estate office, laughing when she corrected him. Remembered the patience with which he had read her proposal. Remembered that he had recognized her handwriting and waited for her to claim it herself. None of those memories contained the usual language of courtship, yet together they formed something sturdier than flattery. He had not fallen in love with the transformation. She had not become more beautiful, more fashionable, or less awkward with a ledger under her arm. He had simply looked long enough to understand what was already there. Lynette, who had spent 19 long years quietly believing that invisibility was simply the fixed shape her entire life was destined to take, found in that moment she could not speak a single word at all. It was Serafina, astonishingly, who finally broke the frozen moment, stepping forward boldly from the hushed crowd with genuine tears standing openly in her eyes, and taking her younger sister's trembling hand firmly in her own. "Say something, dearest," Serafina whispered, laughing and crying all at once. "You have never once in your entire life been at a loss for exactly the right numbers. Surely you can find the right words now, when it truly matters most." The old imagined rivalry, if it had ever genuinely existed outside Lynette's own fearful private imagination at all, dissolved completely in that single unguarded moment between the two sisters, replaced at last by something neither had ever quite been permitted to freely feel toward the other in years. Pure, uncomplicated, sisterly pride. "If I become your Duchess," Lynette said, quiet enough that the front row of listeners leaned forward, "I will still intend to interfere with your accounts whenever they are wrong." A ripple of startled laughter moved through the room. The Duke's expression, so controlled before Parliament and creditors alike, softened openly. "I should consider anything less a breach of our understanding." Lynette's own laugh escaped then, shaky and astonished. She put her hand in his. "Then yes, Your Grace." Serafina made an undignified sound somewhere between a sob and a cheer, which finally broke the ballroom's rigid silence into applause. The weeks after the ball were less tidy than society preferred. Percival attempted first to deny the false invoices, then to blame clerks, then to imply the Duke had misunderstood ordinary household expenses. The records defeated each explanation. To avoid criminal proceedings and a public family scandal, he signed over his small property and investments toward restitution and left for the continent, under an agreement that ended his involvement in Ashcombe affairs permanently. The Duke replaced him not with another relative, but with a professional accountant whose work would be independently reviewed each quarter. Lynette approved of that provision before she approved the new carpets for the London drawing room. Lynette turned back slowly to face the Duke and found her own voice at last, steady despite the vast sea of watching eyes fixed upon her. "I never once wrote in that ledger expecting a single soul to read it," she said clearly, "let alone a Duke of the realm. I did it simply because someone had to, and because for once in my entire quiet life, it felt genuinely good to be useful to something larger than myself alone." "You were never merely useful, Miss Marchbanks," the Duke said quietly. The words meant for her ears alone far more than the watching room's. "You were simply the only person in that entire ballroom who never once asked to be truly seen, which is precisely why I found I could not stop seeing you." He extended his hand toward her then, not for a customary dance, but in the old, formal manner that traditionally preceded a question the entire watching room already understood was surely coming, and asked her, in front of 200 astonished witnesses who had arrived that night expecting an entirely different bride altogether, to become his Duchess. Rosamond's recovery likewise required effort after the romantic celebrations ended. Sir Reginald began attending estate meetings rather than signing whatever was placed before him. At first he asked foolish questions. Lynette answered them. Eventually he asked better ones. Lady Marchbanks reduced the household entertaining budget without pretending it was temporary and personally visited the seamstress whose bills had gone unpaid. Seraphina, freed from the requirement to marry the richest man available, discovered she preferred the company of a widowed baron who spoke more about his young daughter's education than his horses. Their courtship began slowly enough that no one could mistake it for another rescue campaign. Sir Reginald, watching quietly from the edge of the crowded room with tears he no longer even bothered to hide from anyone, understood at last the true full size of the debt his entire family owed. The quiet daughter he had so very nearly overlooked completely, a profound debt no cleverly restructured repayment plan could ever fully hope to settle. Lady Marchbanks, standing steadily beside her weeping husband, whispered a genuine apology too quiet for anyone else present to hear. But Lynette herself and Lynette, generous now in the particular way only the truly overlooked can finally afford to be once genuinely seen at last, simply squeezed her proud mother's hand gently and let 19 long years of careful silence dissolve softly into something far gentler and kinder. Lynette's engagement to the Duke was longer than fashionable gossip expected, because she insisted on completing Rosamond's first 2 payments under the new schedule before setting a wedding date. The Duke did not object. He spent part of that summer at Ashcombe, part at Rosamond, and an unreasonable number of afternoons discussing drainage, cottages, and tenant schools with the woman he intended to marry. Mrs. Abbott observed these meetings with profound satisfaction, and never once admitted that she had suspected the direction of matters from the first muddy afternoon. On the morning Lynette finally left Rosamond as a bride, she went alone to the old nursery. Her grandmother's account books still occupied the bottom shelf, their leather cracked, their pages smelling of dust and time. She took 1 volume with her. Not because she needed the figures, but because the child who had hidden there with numbers deserved to arrive at Ashcombe too. Downstairs, Seraphina called that the carriage was waiting. Lynette looked once around the room where she had learned to make herself invisible and felt no bitterness. That girl had survived by becoming useful. The woman leaving now understood she was allowed to be loved as well. Percival Vane left England quietly for the continent before the month was out, his debts to his cousins settled only by the forced sale of his own modest property, and no one at Fenimore House ever spoke his name again above a whisper. Rosemont Hall was fully saved at last, its careful ledgers finally balanced by the very same daughter no one in that grand old house had ever once thought to properly credit, and within the year Seraphina herself found a quieter, truer match in a widowed baron who had watched her defend her sister that night and decided sensibly that a woman with such loyalty in her heart was worth considerably more than a diamond of the first, water. And Lynette Marchbanks, who had spent her entire quiet life firmly believing she was the sister nobody would ever choose, walked out of Fenimore House that unforgettable night on the arm of a duke who had chosen her precisely and entirely because she had never once asked anyone in the world to. Years later, people who had attended the Fenimore Ball told the story inaccurately, as society always did. They said the Duke shocked London by rejecting the beautiful sister for the plain one. They spoke of romance as though it had happened in a single walk across a ballroom. The truth was quieter. He had chosen the woman who noticed the missing pounds, the flooded field, the dishonest invoice, the tenant no one else remembered. And she had chosen the man who, when shown the truth, did not ask her to soften it. Their marriage was built not on a moment of spectacle, but on the rare intimacy of two people willing to look closely. That was why it lasted. The wedding, when it came, was smaller than society expected. Lynette refused an enormous London spectacle and chose the parish church between Rosemont and Ashcombe, where tenants from both estates could attend. Seraphina stood beside her in blue rather than ivory. Sir Reginald walked his younger daughter down the aisle with a steadier step than he had possessed in years, and Lady Marchbanks cried before the vows began. The Duke had one private gift waiting at Ashcombe afterward. The old slim ledger, rebound but otherwise untouched. Inside the cover he had written only a date, the March afternoon on which she had accidentally left it behind. Lynette laughed when she saw it. Some love stories began with flowers. Theirs, appropriately, began with an error in a column. In the first autumn of their marriage, Lynette established a small schoolroom near the Ashcombe estate office for the daughters, as well as the sons of tenants who wished to learn figures beyond basic household arithmetic. The proposal caused enough raised eyebrows to amuse the Duke for weeks. Lynette answered every objection with the same calm logic she had once applied to his drainage accounts. An estate prospered when the people who kept it running were allowed to become competent. Mrs. Abbott attended the opening and declared the benches too narrow, the ink too watery, and the entire enterprise excellent. Seraphina visited with her future stepdaughter and spent an afternoon teaching the children a country dance, proving that not every useful skill belonged in a ledger. Sometimes Lynette still caught herself stepping aside when a room grew crowded, automatically making space for someone she assumed mattered more. The habit didn't vanish because a duke loved her. On those occasions he never dragged her into the center or made a spectacle of correcting her. He simply looked for her, found her, and made room beside him. It was a small courtesy, almost invisible to everyone else. To Lynette it contained the whole difference between being displayed and being seen. If this story found something quiet and true inside you tonight, if you have ever once been the quiet one, the useful one, the daughter the room always somehow looked past without seeing, remember this one simple truth. Being truly seen was never really a matter of luck at all. It was only ever a matter of someone, somewhere, finally choosing to look.